Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith with this special episode 200. This is getting released in 2023. Episode 1 was released in 2019. And I'm excited to have back for this episode Michael Guimarin, a friend of mine, who is in episode 83, talking about Sensemaking, a tool for being a little bit less insane in this world. And that episode was released back in 2021, a whole 2 years ago. And the world's only gotten more crazy. So this episode is going to help you deal with the fact that there's too much information in your world. It's making you sick. It's distracting you. It may be causing discord among your family and friends. And you need a strategy for managing your information environment just as much as you manage other parts of your business and your life. You intentionally choose what to eat. You intentionally choose how to move. But too many of us let other people decide for us how we're going to consume information. That's going to stop today. Michael Guimarin's going to show us the way. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really glad and happy to be here. Being episode 200 is so exciting. I'm thrilled that you were able to do this. I know just how hard it is to regularly put out a podcast, having only ever made it to 10 episodes. So the fact that you did 20 times more is really an accomplishment. Congratulations, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. It's been amazing. And it's really understanding what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, and having a good self-awareness of, I really like starting things. I'm mediocre at maintaining things and at finishing things. And so bringing people on my team who were much better than me, who really drive satisfaction from operating systems and from also completing projects, and then handing them the guidelines and saying, here's the starting point, make this better if you want to, or just keep on following what I've already done, and then just continuing to feed them what they need. So just knowing yourself and knowing what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, and building a plan for how to, in this case, run a podcast where I don't do a lot of the back end. I do almost none of the back end work. I have a team and they run an algorithm, and the outcome of the algorithm is, 200 episodes. But it's not me who did that exactly. It's me working within a system and these other people who are supporting me, which brings us to what you're talking about today, which is information environment stuff. We're recording this on a Monday, and I just spent 2 entire days off Twitter because I am an information addict who is driving myself insane. And way back in 2020, I was taking your class on the information diet, how to better manage your information space. And I ended up taking an entire month off from Twitter right before the presidential election. And I was vastly healthier for it. And I still occasionally do little bits of that. This weekend, no Twitter for me. I'm going to disconnect myself from an information source. My phone's going to stay mostly off. I'm just not going to connect with people. And that has enriched my life. I do not know how to quantify how much better my life is because I have used the tools you've put in front of me. So for people who have never heard the phrase information diet, but they like the idea of feeling less crazy, can you give us the 101 on what that phrase means?
Yeah, absolutely. A number of years ago, I was a high performance athlete. And when you're trying to be a high performance athlete, you need to have your both training regimen, but also your nutritional regimen dialed in. For example, if you eat only donuts, you're probably not going to perform that well on the field over time. And so you do need to learn a little bit about, healthy foods, how to prepare them, what do they mean for your body? And the idea of an information diet is to take that metaphor, what is it that we're consuming, and try and apply it to the information that we're consuming. And just like when you're an athlete, you might have a different training regimen and nutrition regimen, depending on if you want to be a marathoner or a hockey player, or just somebody that wants to go playing with your grandkids. You need to really also approach the way that you consume information the same way. And so I accidentally, way back in 2020, as you and a number of other people asked me to help you make better decisions, I accidentally stumbled into this entire academic field that didn't exist on what does it mean to have an information diet? How do we chart a course for the particular outcomes that we want? And then, just like you said, what are the basic things that we can do right away to get started?
When I think about my peers, which I'm talking about other business owners, maybe they have teams working for them, but they're also digitally connected a lot. Maybe they are on their phones more than they'd like. Maybe when they look back at how they spent their week, they can identify, well, I would have liked to be outside more, on my phone less, or on my computers less. What are the main culprits of how we are consuming information that isn't good for us? What are the donuts of our information world?
Yeah, there are a number of ways to look at this, right? You can look, and it depends on what your level of resolution is. So, for example, just having a phone, right? So now there are Gen Alpha kids who are 11, 12 years old who are choosing flip phones over smartphones because they don't want to even have that temptation. Gen Z is actually also doing this. So there's a level at the phone, there's a level at the app. So, for example, I don't have TikTok on my phone. And then there's the level at the individual content. So when you talk about being addicted to Twitter, are you following the right people on Twitter for the outcomes that you're trying to generate?
That last part is the key for the outcomes I'm trying to generate, because if you ask me that question and I am answering honestly, it differs depending on the time of day and the day of the week.
Correct. Your ideal information environment, just like, on Saturday, you might have a richer meal, if you will, than Monday for breakfast or Monday for lunch. That would be the same for your information environment. And unfortunately, we don't have the capability yet to get that kind of granularity in what we consume. So, like ideally Monday morning, you only read motivational business stuff, whatever, and all of the deep thinking work you're only putting in for Thursday. And then all the entertainment work is only available to you on the weekend.
Yeah.
And actually being able to time segment the quality and content of information that you're receiving on a per app basis, that would be incredible. And I believe we'll get there within a couple of years. Certainly we'll be able to do that with artificial intelligence. And I'll be right there at the forefront of that, like giving people that skin or user interface or whatever.
Yeah, that sounds great. What I've had to go do is do things like take Twitter off my phone. So I can still log into Twitter on a browser and read stuff. But then it got to where I was using that more often, that the percentage of time I was using that productively for work versus as a distraction, and perhaps a harmful distraction, I did not like the ratio. So I logged out on my browser.
Yeah.
So now I can go to Twitter on my browser. If I type in someone's full name, total hassle.
Yeah.
But the friction is what saves me from myself.
Correct. Well, here's what's very interesting, right? Like pull that, what you're doing, into the physical, into the diet metaphor. So functionally, what you're saying is, I'm addicted to Halloween candy. And like try and translate what you're doing and framing it in terms of Halloween candy. I bet you don't eat Halloween candy and you don't buy it when you go to the store every single time. And yet that is what you are doing from an information perspective. And you're so addicted to Halloween candy that the only thing that you know how to do to stop eating Halloween candy is to just stop eating.
Yeah, I've done two ways of dealing with sugar that have worked. One is complete abstention. My longest run is 75 days with zero artificial sugar other than a tiny amount in sausage. And also maple syrup and honey are okay. Or when I want to be slightly less strict, I've said I can have whatever I want at the store, but I have to enjoy it while I'm at the store or on the drive home. So no sugar gets to cross the boundary of my property lines.
Right. So now the question is, how do you do that from an information perspective? I think your example is very illustrative because in a lot of ways, it's the way that most alcoholics who join Alcoholics Anonymous are, right? Which is like, I'm just trying to abstain from drinking for these 24 hours. To your point, I'm just trying to abstain from consuming any content on Twitter for the weekend.
Yeah.
And it becomes entirely about adding friction and changing your motivation. And one of the core concepts of the info diet that I try to put forward is that these are interventions at the decision-making level, not interventions at the environmental level. And so there's sort of like three concepts that I teach. The first is detox, the second is diet, and then the third is discovery. And so what I would say is you have to detox from the bad habits, and then you have to construct a deliberate information environment so that when you do open up Twitter on Saturday, you don't get all of that crazy stuff. And the problem is it's more like a garden than a library. And what I mean by that is that with a garden, you have to constantly be in there weeding bad plants out. Whereas with a library, you get to affirmatively decide which books to put in your library once. And it's not like, crazy books show up in your library, but that is exactly what happens in your garden. and your plants, the ones you like the most, can die because weeds can start growing right next to them if you're not out there tending it every day. And so then the question becomes, what are the habits and what are the little tricks that I can manipulate and use to make that as low effort as possible? Because I bet you most people who are listening here are not going to be able to take the same level of interventions that Brian Keith is taking, that you're taking. And I don't think that you're going to be able to do these things long term either. Although I have seen you do it for 3 years now.
Well, I continue to experiment with different things. Recently, in the last couple of weeks, I decided to start blocking words on Twitter. And I thought, I really like to be informed, but that doesn't mean that being informed is good for me. And that is a hard hit to take for someone who identifies with their intellect and they're being aware of things. To say, do I actually want to be aware of what's happening in Ukraine right now? And I do want to be aware, but do I actually want to be aware?
Yeah, I want to bring a real live example because you mentioned Ukraine. Do you remember Gary Johnson, who ran as the Libertarian candidate in the 2016 election?
I was reading him about Twitter just this morning, yes.
I'll share for everyone who didn't also read the same thing that clearly both of us read, which is that Gary Johnson was basically eliminated from contention back in 2016 because he didn't know what the latest was on Aleppo. And you can make the argument that he had constructed his information environment to not consume junk mainstream media BS narratives. And one of those BS narratives that all of us were consuming at the time was about Aleppo. And everyone made the wrong choice in discounting Gary Johnson because he was already ahead of us on this particular issue, which is, not listening to whatever, propaganda is being pushed in the press. And I think that's very salient to reflect on. What are those things that are taking up our mind space that actually don't matter to what it is that we're trying to accomplish? I think people are going to be listening to this episode and thinking to themselves, okay, great, these guys are esoterically talking about basically turning my information on or off with a spigot. I can't really do that because I have to communicate at work. I have to communicate with my family. I have fear of missing out on these various things. And so how am I going to calibrate what it is that I'm consuming so that it's not a fire hose of water that I'm consuming, but more like, a water fountain? And again, for me, it always gets back to, is the information I'm consuming helping to get me closer to a specific outcome that I want? And people will wave their hands and say something like, oh, I want to be more informed. That's not good enough. I want to be more informed about Ukraine because being informed on that topic is going to allow me to change my vote in the next election. That would be an example of an outcome with concrete impacts on the decisions that you're making. And I know, Brian, that I've given you this advice at least half a dozen times, and I'll give it again. When you are consuming information and it's not Saturday or Sunday, you really need to be asking yourself that question. What is the concrete outcome that is going to change as a result of me consuming this information? And if you can't identify it or it's not aligned with your mission and purpose, you should not be consuming it.
This is why I don't read email very much. I've discovered that 90%, 95% of the salient work information in my life happens in Slack with all my various clients and my projects that I'm involved in. And so really, email is not where people who need my attention are. That's where the people who do not need or deserve my attention, that's where they go. Not most of the time. On rare occasion, something happens important in email. But mostly it's occasionally Twitter DMs, it's mostly Slack. And so if I want to be focused on something, I might take the first hour or two of my day and don't even open up Slack. Just sit there and think, okay, of the top 3 projects in my head, which one can I make the most progress on right now before I do anything else? Definitely including Twitter. And then after that, okay, now go to Slack and go look through everything on Slack, answer everyone's questions. So now everyone else can move on their stuff and then say, okay, now given the information that I have available to me based on what everyone else has told me across all projects, what is worth working on next? But I often go multiple days without looking at email at all because it's mostly a distraction.
Yeah.
And that sounds insane to me for a decade ago to say, so your plan is to start a business and not read your email.
I was just thinking about this. I don't check my email every single day either. Maybe 3 or 4 times a week, I'll check my email, on a good week. And then the other thing was, I'm curious. So anybody who's listening, who's a technologist, there's actually an opportunity to disrupt email on the consumption side. And you basically just get an AI to summarize everything and you say, I only want to deal with messages that are urgent and important. And if it comes from a brand or isn't specifically targeted at me in that I haven't replied to the sender before, then I only want to like look at it when I have a question. So for example, I get 500 emails a day and only two of them maybe come from a human being that I want to communicate with, which is why I only check my email once a week because there's only 15 messages in there that I need. The rest of it's on Slack or Twitter DMs. So I think it's very smart, Brian.
When it comes to moding or gating your communications channels, which in email it's pretty obvious. You can mark something as spam, where you can have a folder where everyone gets routed into a folder called clients if they're your clients. But so a lot of us are careful in email because we very clearly recognize we get too many emails coming in, it hurts us. But then we're casual when it comes to information entering into our brains from any of the social media apps, and in some cases, network news or mainstream media. Why do you think that is, that we're vigilant in some areas, but we're sloppy in other areas?
Well, the business model for email is non existent, right? It's like I pay $5 a month to get email management or I get it for free, right? And there's like a little bit of advertising in there, but it's the companies that are running the email, they're not making their business off of running email. And so the tools to manage the influx of messaging are there. The tools to guide your progression, your goals, your checklists, whatnot, they exist, right? Whether it's Gmail with their folders or Superhuman or whatever. Whereas on social media, the entire point of the application is to get you into a aroused state for as long as possible so that you can be most susceptible to advertising.
For people who've never heard that definition before, could you say that again?
Yeah, the point of the social media apps, TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, etc., is to get you into an aroused state for as long as possible so that you're most susceptible to the advertising on the app.
I was talking with a friend about this and why it was that reading blogs was potentially hazardous to his health because of all the advertising. He said, why use an ad blocker? And I said, well, that doesn't actually help you because most people don't use effective ad blockers. And so the blog post is still being written to go get you to click the advertising that you can't see. And just because you can't see the ads doesn't mean it's not written to get you to click those ads.
Correct. Yeah, you're basically reinforcing these dopamine loops, and there's no counterforce that you have available to you. It's like you versus 1,000 people at Facebook who are paid $1 million a year to trick you. How are you going to be successful? Like, imagine if all the food companies in the world were like, how do we, because they're owned by the pharma companies in this theoretic example, how can we get people as fat and sick as possible? And then that's what they did. And then they told you, like, gave you all kinds of conflicting information on health and then told you to, like, just go for it at the supermarket, right? You would, like, observe that our society is getting fatter and sicker if that were the case.
I have a new metaphor that might be brilliant or maybe it's not, but here it is. The best way for me to not lose against Michael Jordan in basketball is to not play.
That's right.
Actually, it's the only path. There is no amount of anything I could do to not lose that game.
Correct. Now, the question is, what happens if you have to play that game because you have no choice? That's really the point that people are at, right? Like, we get the war games, the only winning move is not to play, but we're all connected in this complex environment where we have to participate. And so then the question becomes, okay, how is it that if I have to play basketball and Michael Jordan is on the field, how is it that I'm not just going to lose constantly? And basically what you're saying is that there's a whole set of people who say, oh, it's about motivation, because even though I'm never going to win against Michael Jordan, the fact that I show up every day and dribble and get a little bit better at shooting means that I'm going to eke out a positive existence. But like, this is almost feels zero sum because it's so stacked against you. And so then the question, then you're like, okay, well, do I shift my priorities? So am I less concerned with winning the game because I'm always going to lose? And am I more concerned with the other players on the team and forming relationships with them? Do I find that more fulfilling? Yeah, I mean, I think this is like really hard question to ask because you can't not play basketball in this example. Can't do it.
Yeah, there's multiple ways of winning, but society only recognizes some of them. In today's society, you could definitely just not use technology at all the way down to not having a phone. You could do that. but the consequences are enormous unless you already have a lot of money. You're just going to be cut off from the economic engine.
Well, I'll push back on that. The Amish seem to be doing fairly well. The absolute craziest thing for me, Brian, and I know this is far afield for our normal conversations, is that Orthodox religious people, Jews, Christians, Muslims, who are like really Orthodox, they seem to be the happiest people I've ever met.
Well, that comes to living within your nature.
Yeah.
There was a time where I was coming back from my, let's see, it was my second 20-mile hike of my life, 20-mile day hike. Or no, it was my first one, I think. And it was in the Boy Scouts, of course, like all good stories are. And we're coming back down after climbing up to the base of Mount Olympus in the Olympic Mountains in Washington State. And we'd done this 20-mile day hike. And I was, 14, something like that. And we're getting back to our fire, and only me and two other scouts and one of the adults do this extra part. Everyone else did a normal 10-mile day hike. But we did 20 miles. And we're getting back to camp. And I had this feeling of, I could just do this every day. I could go out again right now. Now, yes, that's just the euphoric waves of dopamine, but whatever. And, it felt so good. It felt so right to actually use my body in that way. And then coming down from Mount Rainier, one of the times that I've climbed that mountain, that it felt, I came home and, oh, this is fantastic. This is what I'm born to do. And that feeling stays with you for days. And over weeks, it fades. And initially, you have the clarity of, I'm supposed to do this. I'm doing what I'm built to do. And then it fades because you're back to mowing the lawn, opening mail, and cooking over an automatic fire in your kitchen. And you lose the memory that you resurface briefly of, here's who you are.
Yeah, it goes back to, I think this is part of our evolution, Brian, that I've talked about over the last 3 years. I believe ultimately that we are in a spiritual war, and the war is fought inside of ourselves. So if you were to ask me 3 years ago, when I sort of stumbled into this area of information management, how to do it, I would say be really focused on your goals, be really focused on outcomes, think critically about the bias of the sources that you're using of information and what goals that they have. But like ultimately, as you just pointed out, right, which basically talked about waking up and then falling back asleep, this is really a spiritual question, which is gets at the root of like, what is it that you actually want in your life? And then how can you organize yourself around what it is that you want? And all of the things that I used to say, it's not that they're wrong. They're not wrong. They're actually quite right. It's just that the obstacle is the way, and the obstacle is a spiritual obstacle, and it's ourselves. And so it's like the hard work that we have to do internally is what will help to come to define us externally. And then when you've done that, all of the information stuff becomes very easy, and you get a significant amount of joy. And I think it's so easy in our society to consume information like consuming donuts or Halloween candy because we don't want to do the difficult work of preparing steak, right? It's like, I'd rather go to Dunkin'. It's easier to go to Dunkin' Donuts and get a donut than it is to like butcher a cow and then cook it and then eat it. I think that if there's anything that you can do to start working on that spiritual stuff of asking yourself, like, what is it that I really want out of my life? And what am I driving towards? You know, like I think I said to you earlier, everybody only gets 2 lives. Every man lives 2 lives, and his second life begins when he realizes he only has one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's how I think I approach the information environment today, is I ask people like, well, spiritually, where are you at? And that is the hardest battle to fight. And so that's the first battle that you should fight.
I'm going to add a question to your question, what do I want? And that question is, what do I deserve? That if you believe that you deserve a clean environment.
That's only if you're honest with yourself, Brian. I think most people are not honest with themselves. They'll say, like, I deserve to have a Bugatti, and I deserve this, and I deserve that, but they haven't really put in the hard work. I think the real question is, like, what is the most difficult thing in my life, and why am I not doing it? And you have to ask that question every single day.
Let's tie that back to keeping our information space clean. What is the most difficult thing in your life, and why are you not doing it? How can we use that question to clean up our information environment?
Yeah, it's very simple. At any given time, we're all facing challenges, and there's one big challenge, one big rock that we have to overcome, go around, pass through, or move out of the way at a time. And as we do that, we're going to clean up our information environment. And so, for example, maybe in your case, the reason why you have to keep using the same intervention of information fasting, which is what that's called, is because there's something else spiritually in your life that you need to deal with. Because the addiction, like, you don't just get an addiction, you get an addiction because there's a reason. So you're going towards consuming junk information because there's something else in your life spiritually that you haven't dealt with, right? So that would be the way that I would think about that is there's probably some very difficult thing that you're avoiding. And the avoidance technique, what I call the de-escalation loop, is to go consume junk information on the internet. And you don't really want to go and deal with that really difficult thing, but you also recognize that consuming junk information on the internet is not good for you. And so what you do is you put in place a hack to slow down that consumption of junk information, but you don't deal with the desire in the first place.
That goes deep.
Sorry, Brian.
Don't apologize when you don't mean it, Michael. This is why we have such good conversations, because you'll speak the truth.
I know, but it's rough, right?
It is rough.
I'm on your podcast and you like want to give business advice. And I'm like, there's something spiritually that you're not dealing with, Brian, and it's messing you up. And you're like,
but it applies to so many entrepreneurs where why a lot of my friends are successful in business is if you look back far enough, it's because of something they didn't have or some negative experience they had in their lives.
Of course.
Maybe as children.
Chips on shoulders put chips in pockets. How many guys have we met who are deca-millionaires whose lives are a wreck because they were unwilling to do the spiritual work and it was easier to build an empire?
And so the enlightened path is to both deal with the spiritual challenge or the spiritual pain while also contributing and producing in whatever way is appropriate for you.
Yeah, I think the challenge here is that if you deal with the spiritual stuff, a lot of people lose the energy and the direction and the motivation to achieve the financial professional stuff. And so the advice that I normally give to people who get here is if you identify that place in you that is really aligned with what it is that you want to do, we talk a lot about mission, but if you want to take a spiritual angle, you could say like, it's what God put you on the earth to do. If you do that, you'll have unlimited energy and unlimited motivation and unlimited willpower. Otherwise, those things are completely a limited resource that you have to guard very specifically. But if you can identify that purpose, that fundamental purpose, and align yourself with achieving it, which usually is sharing it with others, then everything else will fall away and become easy and you will get the professional success. But if you don't do that, if you don't identify those spiritual roadblocks in your life, might be a relationship, might be whatever, then you are going to put all that extra energy into your finances. And it wouldn't surprise me if a not insignificant percentage of your clients are exactly like that. Like 20% are going to be the I'm fulfilled because I'm doing what I thought that I should be doing, which is ultimately helping other people. And then 80% are like, I don't want to deal with this issue of, whatever happened here in my life. And so I'm going to like focus on my business instead. And I guess the question that you have to ask yourself is, if you get to your $100 million exit or become a billionaire, or whatever it is, the wreck of not dealing with those relationships or your health or whatever it is it worth it? Everybody who gets there says it's not, by the way.
Michael, thank you for being back on Redbeard Radio. For folks who want to follow Michael more, it's Michael Guimarin on Twitter. That's Guimarin. Michael, any final thoughts you want to share with us?
Yeah, I would say that the vast majority of my one-on-one clients now, like this is the kind of conversation that we have. So if this is kind of appealing to you and you want a guide, like reach out for me for that. But if you want to do it on your own, by the time this podcast is released, I should have like a 1-day detox course available. And it's a literal book that comes in the mail that you actually have to fill out. And it makes starting this journey a lot easier. So follow me on Twitter at Michael Guimarin. And by the time that you're listening to this podcast, there should be a link around there to take this 1-day detox course. Very, very inexpensive. I think it's going to be like $30 or something like that. So almost no risk for you other than your time, which is your most valuable asset. But check it out. And then, of course, if you're interested in the very, very hard work that Brian and I were just talking about, I also help people with that. But I understand that, not everybody wants to do that. So thank you, Brian. Appreciate you having me on today. And congratulations again on episode 200.
Thank you, Michael. We'll see you all on episode 201 next week.